So, let's get right into it. There's this huge question hanging in the air right now. Are we in a new Cold War? It feels like it, right? But to really get our heads around what's happening today, we actually need to start with a really personal and honestly kind of awkward moment between two of the most powerful leaders on the planet. Back in May of 2024, Xi Jinping gave Vladimir Putin a hug. Now, I know what you're thinking. A hug. What's the big deal? Well, for Xi, it's a huge deal. This is a guy who's famous for being incredibly stern, very formal. You could almost say he's allergic to public displays of emotion.
I mean, seriously, can you imagine Xi grinning in a cowboy hat like Deng Xiaoping did? Or, totally losing his cool with a reporter on camera like Jiang Zemin once did? No way. So this hug, it wasn't just a hug. It was a message, a very carefully planned political signal about a major shift in how the world works.
And to really understand the weight of that one embrace, we've got to rewind the clock. Because for the better part of 60 years, China and Russia weren't buddies, not even close. They were bitter rivals. And believe it or not, their big falling out is a huge part of why the world looks the way it does today. Okay, so it all started back in 1950. Mao goes to Moscow, they sign this big alliance, everything's great. But it fell apart fast over disagreements on ideology and who was really in charge. By 1969, they were literally on the brink of nuclear war. And here is the pivot that changed everything. That split made a very nervous China open to talking with the US, which directly led to Nixon's famous trip to Beijing, and a few years later, formal relations.
That single event set off this incredible chain reaction. It's what allowed China to launch its famous reform and opening policy. That's what turned the country into the world's factory and completely reshaped the global economy. Seriously, without that 60-year-old rivalry, the very phone you might be watching this on probably wouldn't exist in the same way.
So, if their split was so world-changing, what on earth could have pushed these two giants back together? Well, it turns out they found a new common enemy. Or maybe I should say a common rival, the United States.
This reunion didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn. First came the 2008 financial crisis, which really shook the world's confidence in American leadership. Then in 2014, Russia invaded Crimea, and the West basically kicked it out of the club. That sent Putin looking for new friends, and by 2022, they were ready to make things official.
And what's wild is just how much Putin and Xi are cut from the same cloth, both personally and politically. I mean, look at this. They're the same age, they both run their countries in a strikingly similar way, crushing dissent, pumping up nationalism, and, getting rid of term limits so they can stay in power for as long as they want. It's kind of the perfect match.
And this goes beyond just political convenience. There seems to be a real personal bond here. Since 2012, Xi and Putin have met over 40 times. Just to put that into perspective, that's more than double the number of times he's met with all other world leaders combined. They give each other friendship medals. Putin once brought Xi birthday ice cream. It's this genuine bond that builds a level of trust that lets them coordinate on a whole different level.
And all of this led to that famous declaration of a no-limits friendship. And the timing? You just can't make this up. It was announced in Beijing on February 4th, 2022, right at the start of the Winter Olympics, just 20 days before Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Ever since that invasion, China's been playing this very, very careful game. Some people are calling it pro-Russian neutrality. So on paper, they're neutral. They don't vote to condemn the invasion at the UN, but when you look at what they're actually doing, it's a whole different story. And this shows you exactly what that pro-Russian part means in practice. So Europe hits Russia with sanctions and slashes its oil imports way down. And who steps in to pick up the slack? China. They became Russia's #1 customer, buying up a ton of that oil, probably at a nice discount too. Because of this, Russia's dependence on China has absolutely exploded. More than half of everything Russia imports now comes from China. That's double what it was just a few years ago. And we're talking about crucial stuff here like dual-use technology, things like microchips that can be used to build a washing machine or a missile. So you put it all together, the rival blocs, the proxy war in Ukraine, the nuclear threats. It brings us right back to that big question we started with. Now that we have all this context, can we, should we, really call this a new Cold War? Let's be honest, the parallels are pretty striking. It's hard to ignore them. You've got these rival blocs forming, you have a brutal proxy war raging in Ukraine, You have this global competition to win over countries that don't want to pick a side, and you have a terrifying new nuclear arms race heating up. It all feels eerily familiar. But, and this is a really big but, if you look closer, the differences are just as critical. Unlike the old days, Russia and China don't have a formal military pact binding them together. And maybe the biggest difference of all? Their economies are not separate from the West. They're deeply, messily tangled up with ours. This isn't two separate worlds anymore. It's one very complicated one.
And here's the absolute core of it. They don't even want the same thing. Russia, at this point, has very little to lose. It kind of wants to burn the whole system down. China, on the other hand, has become incredibly wealthy and powerful because of that system. It doesn't want to destroy the game. It wants to rewrite the rules so that it's the one in charge.
So China's pitch to the rest of the world is based on these two big ideas. First, sovereignty, which is basically code for nobody gets to criticize what a government does inside its own borders. And second, multipolarity, the idea of a world with lots of great powers instead of just one. And for a lot of countries, that's a pretty attractive sales pitch.
But here is the massive, glaring contradiction. How can you go around the world preaching about sovereignty while your no-limits best friend is actively, violently violating the sovereignty of Ukraine? For a lot of smaller countries, especially China's neighbors, that hypocrisy is just impossible to overlook. And if you look down the road, you can already start to see some cracks forming in this friendship. For one, China is now way more powerful than Russia, which is a total reversal of the old dynamic. They're also starting to compete for influence in the same parts of the world. And frankly, Beijing gets pretty nervous every time Putin starts making reckless nuclear threats. Their interests are aligned, but they're not identical.
So after weighing all the similarities and all the differences, we're left with this debate that's happening right now in foreign policy circles. Should we even be using the label Cold War? And it turns out, what we decide to call this thing, well, it actually matters a lot. There are really two schools of thought here. On one hand, using the Cold War label can provide some clarity. It forces the US and its allies to wake up and create a real strategy for reality that's already here. But there's a real danger too. The label could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, pushing China and Russia even closer together and fueling this paranoid us versus them mindset back home. And let's never forget what's at stake. The last Cold War brought out the absolute best in us. It pushed us to create the internet, to land on the moon. But it also brought out our absolute worst, the paranoia of McCarthyism, proxy wars that killed millions, and the constant, terrifying threat of nuclear war.
And that leaves us with one final urgent question. As we head into this new era of intense global competition, we face a choice. Will this struggle, whatever name history ends up giving it, inspire our greatest achievements? Or will it lead us right back to repeating our most regrettable and most dangerous mistakes?